Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three different topics. The first one's going to be the ongoing ethnic cleansing and genocide of Artsakh. Then we're going to move on to talk about what are the reasons, what were the trigger points that pushed Aliyev to go for the genocide model in Artsakh. And lastly, we're going to talk about Armenians' ratification and joining of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and what that means. What we've had so far is we've had over 100,000 people that have been ethnically cleansed and forced out of Artsakh. We're down to essentially the last few hundred. Over the weekend, there was essentially an evacuation of the most vulnerable people, people from mental hospitals or the elderly who were abandoned and are alone, and other people that had special needs that were transferred out over the weekend. There's hardly anybody left at this point. We're probably talking in the hundreds, if not less than that. So essentially for the first time in over 2,000 years, the Armenians in Artsakh have ceased to exist as any kind of a relevant population. When we move on to other news in Artsakh, they've continued their efforts in illegally detaining state officials, former state officials. And last week, today, actually, there was a formal dissolution of the Artsakh state by whatever is left of the puppet government that's controlled by the Russians. This was obviously coordinated with Moscow. And this particular legalism has actually a purpose because they want to make it sound like this is just, that country dissolved, and everybody can either, join, become citizens of Aliyev's country, or they can leave. And this is designed by the Russians, working with them to give themselves legal cover for this. The dissolution of the state itself was entirely illegal. The person who dissolved the state has no authority to do so. So it's a completely illegitimate decision, and it was actually outlined by statements put up by Artsakh, who was the former state official in many different offices in Artsakh, who's actually in Armenia right now. When we go over the response to this ethnic cleansing, as far as how the international community or Armenia has responded to helping people, you have different variations. Armenian civil society has frankly been fantastic, and if it was not for the massive networks of people helping each other, we would have a much greater disaster in our hand than we even do now, and what we have now is a disaster. The International Red Cross, frankly, has been exceptionally good. Our local governments have been very good, especially the governor of Sunik and other local authorities. The national government, frankly, at this point, has been generally very poor in its response, except for essentially a willingness to spend money and put money in the hands of people. But even those mechanisms have not really been established. But essentially everybody who was ethnically cleansed out of Artsakh, every family member gets $100 a month for the next 6 months as a starter in their transition. So that's where we're at as far as the response is concerned. Now I'm going to move on to a last Artsakh-specific issue. And I want to pay special attention to this to my favorite degenerate organization, the United Nations. Last weekend, essentially after everyone had been ethnically cleansed, the regime in Baku allowed the United Nations to actually visit Artsakh for the first time in 30 years. And what a visit it was. This was led by this woman named Vladanka Andreeva, who's the head of the UN Baku office. Well known for two things. She's either rumored to be on the payroll of the Azeri regime, or she's a completely useful idiot.
United Nations is a trusted partner to the government of Azerbaijan.
They arrived there. They were guided by the Baku regime officials. They only visited Stepanakert, apparently for about an hour. The country teams that were essentially involved with this were Pakistan, Turkey, and Albania, and we all know how unbiased they are. And their reports are actually quite amazing, because they said they were actually surprised by what looked like the sudden departure of the population, and they couldn't understand why that would happen. They were not allowed to go anywhere outside of Stepanakert, and then they said that anybody that spoke to them did not report of any atrocities that the regime had carried out in the first couple of days of the invasion. Now I'm going to move on to the official statement of their mission declaring it. Let me just go over it. It says, the mission is aimed at assessing the situation on the ground and identify humanitarian needs of both people remaining and those on the move. And then they go on to estimate that there are only 50 to 1,000 Armenians that are left in Artsakh. Apparently, that doesn't raise questions about why these people had to leave in terror. By the way, since as far as helping refugees in Armenia, the UN has essentially been absent in its responsibilities. And no UN official, including Secretary General, has ever denounced the regime or actually called what's going on ethnic cleansing or even denounced it in any way. You know, this would be subject to analysis by me, but frankly, they're not worthy of analysis. So I think the best answer is the video that we're going to play for you.
If I were human, I believe my response would be, go to hell.
Now let's move on to the second topic of the day, which is to answer the question why Ilham at this time period in history, decided to go for the full genocide model in Artsakh and not for any others. I think there's multiple reasons for that, almost all of them quite rational, to be honest, from his perspective, as evil as it is. He was very clear that he had no intention of allowing the post-2020 consensus, the status quo, to become the consensus, because if that goes on, that's what the world expects, that yes, Armenians can live there in a democratic self-governing system with Russian peacekeepers, and this is not something that he was going to allow to stand to become the norm. This goes on for 5 to 10 years, and that becomes the base standard that people expect. Secondly, he understands very clearly that the juxtaposition between these two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, is going to change over the next 5 or 10 years. And that what he could get away with now would be much more difficult for him to do 5 or 10 years from now. Third, the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine actually solidified the Moscow-Baku-Ankara alliance and made Moscow far more reliant on these two other tyrannical governments as far as its needs when it comes to laundering its oil, laundering its gas through Azerbaijan, or all the illegal sanction-busting products that go through Turkey that are fueling the Russian war effort. This was obviously the invasion on the 19th of Artsakh was actually choreographed, green-lighted by the Russian regime, whose primary concern at this point is simply one thing, which is to overthrow the current Armenian government and to undo Armenia's pivot to the West. And this is a change that essentially ethnic cleansing in Artsakh was a price that the Russians were willing to pay, even if it meant that in the long term they have no presence there, if it means that they can quash Armenia's move to the West. This was obviously abetted by a lack of Western reaction, and you can see the crescendo of events. It started with the phony environmentalists blocking the road, then it was the military, then it's the roadblock, then it's the complete blockade. And since none of them were responded to by the West, why would he not believe that this would not be responded to? And he actually ended up being correct. If you look at the statements that were made by EU and US leaders in September of this year, if these statements were made actually in January, when the blockade started, we would probably not be looking at these results. In closing on this topic, essentially he made a bet, Aliyev was, and his bet actually turned out to be correct. A week after committing genocide, he actually gets invited, no less than by the EU president, to a summit in Grenada, as if he's some normal human being or a normal political leader and not a war criminal. And then after that, he actually cancels this meeting, demanding for the inclusion of the Turkish president and the exclusion of the French president. This is actually an interesting, we need to understand this summit that was canceled is actually very important, could be very dangerous, is because it's very clear that what Ilham wants to do is to move to a negotiating format that is entirely controlled by Russia and Turkey. It's some version of Syria in which they're trading this for that, and not have the West or the international community involved in these negotiations, because he understands that under that scenario, he can do far more damage to this country, i.e. an aggression that will be negotiated out. And he essentially joins both Russia and Turkey in their desire to actually push the West out of this region. And at this point, Armenia is the Western presence in this region. So in many ways, this conflict that it continues is essentially the second war, the second war against the West in Europe after Ukraine. Now let's move on to the last topic, which was Armenia's parliament's ratification of the ICC Rome Statute. Let's talk about a little bit what that means. The Rome Statute outlines the ICC structure and areas of jurisdiction. The ICC can prosecute individuals, but not states, for 4 kinds of crimes: genocide, crime against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Now, what does this mean in real practical terms? First and foremost, we can criminalize any invasion of Armenia by any leader that orders it. For example, the war crimes that were committed on Armenian soil last year by Aliyev's gunmen last September, execution of POWs, rape and murder and other things. We can start the process of prosecuting them. This will also obviously cover any attacks in the future, if they attack Sunik and other things. The reason this has been delayed is because this was based on great Russian opposition to this, and the background to that is the ICC has actually indicted President Putin for alleged crimes in Ukraine. But in this case, this was never about Russia. This was always about Russia trying to protect Baku. Is because everybody knows that no one is ever going to arrest Vladimir Putin, but lesser leaders like Ilham Aliyev are very much in the game as far as people that you can eventually prosecute. Armenia had made many efforts to actually have side agreements with Russia that would essentially exempt them, but their opposition was actually to protect Ilham, because Ilham is actually far more vulnerable to being charged. His assets are in the West, and he does not want to lose the respectability of, being a leader that can only travel to Belarus and Turkmenistan and Turkey. So I think it's very clear that essentially this was to protect Baku's interests, and that's where the opposition comes from, because they don't want anything that will allow us to criminalize his aggressions. There's technical issues and which are not clear about this, if this will actually allow Armenia to file charges against Aliyev for the genocide in Artsakh. I've heard different opinions on this matter. This, in essence, raises the political cost of any future attack on Armenia. And I think, again, the legitimacy issue is huge for Ilham, is because all of his customers are in the West. A lot of the stolen assets are in the West. And again, that respectability that goes with that, he does not want to be dealt with as an African warlord. This will very likely trigger a Russian retaliation against us, either further pressing Aliyev to invade Armenia as their local proxy and puppet. And obviously, I think the start of an economic war, which I'm almost certain is heading our way, to punish this country for its independence and moving in this direction. I found a very interesting video that some of you might have seen. I suspect most of you have not. And I think it tells you all you ever need to know about what we've had to deal with and what this nation and people in Artsakh have had to deal with for the past 2 weeks. That was a video of 12-year-old RN who drove his family, his mother and his younger siblings, for 40 hours. This is a 12-year-old boy that had to do this to save his family from the barbarians that were about to overrun his ancestral home. All I can say is that this boy is more of a man than all of the political leaders around the world, including ours, that have brought us to this moment. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
Why don't our distinguished orators come forward as usual to make their speeches say what they have to say? Because the barbarians are coming today, and they are bored by rhetoric and public speaking. Why this sudden restlessness, this confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly, everyone going home so lost in thought? because night has fallen, and the barbarians have not come. And some who have just returned from the border say there are no barbarians any longer. And now, what's going to happen to us without barbarians? They were, those people, a kind of solution.